Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 6 in our deep dive on neo-Nazis. The patrons voted for us to do a deep dive on this, and it has been quite a journey to learn about. Of course, I've known about Nazis and neo-Nazis my whole life, but I had no idea just how big and scary and problematic the movement is today around the world. It is definitely not just an American problem. It is a movement that is occurring all over the place. So I want to start off by getting back to something we got to in a previous chapter, but we weren't able to go through the whole sequence that I wanted to get through because I feel like this sequence really ties everything together for me anyway. So I want to go back to a video that has to do with the shooting in Buffalo in 2022. Let's rewatch that. But first, let's introduce the podcast. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist, and I'm also a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I'm a book reader for hire, because a lot of people don't like Audible and those things. So.
Okay, so this video is from Vice on YouTube.
In May 2022, a domestic terrorist murdered 10 black people at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York.
The alleged shooter wearing full body armor and tactical gear, targeting people of color.
Reportedly written by the shooter, where he describes his perceptions about the dwindling size of the white population.
So you hear that one of the motivations for the shooting of those innocent people in that supermarket, that grocery store, was this idea of replacement or of white people going away. Right. And when I first learned about that, of course, when the Buffalo shooting news reports were being reported, I must have heard those words, but I didn't know what they meant at the time. And I thought we would go...
Or it was a one-off or something.
Yeah, just like some wackadoo person. But there are probably millions of people around the earth that believe this idea, and not only just believe this idea, because, we talked about in a previous chapter of just like, well, a lot of specific groups of ethnic groups or racial groups or whatever we want to call them will probably not exist in the future, just like there were ethnic and racial groups in the past that don't exist today because of change or, immigration. And so, but what they believe is that it's a conspiracy to wipe them out, genocide of white people, and the only solution is to fight back and to kill. So let's watch another video. So this is something that happened in Norway.
Before his attack, the Buffalo shooter released a manifesto on Discord, largely centered around a conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement, a fantasist notion that there's a shadowy plot to replace white people in Europe and the US with non-white immigrants.
So Berto, in a nutshell, Great Replacement theory, remind us again what this is.
So it started with a French author, Renaud Camus. It's not the famous Camus, I guess. But
It's a different Camus.
Yeah, in 2010. And he just wrote a couple books. And basically it was, in a gist, it's essentially that there's a conspiracy. There's a conspiracy to systematically replace the white population, but rather through violent, bloody genocide, through just ethnic immigration and replacement by and replacement via some sterilization methods that are covert, and also just the overwhelming numbers,
like vaccines.
But in 2010 it was pre-pandemic, but certainly there were already a lot of conspiracies around medicine and vaccines
soy probably was
exactly right,
because that explains
reducing testosterone in males.
Was that all part of the Camus thing?
Not directly. The soy thing,
but people who followed,
because the whole ideology is that this isn't. Because it's one thing, someone could have written a book saying, hey, you know what? We've looked at trends of birth rates and they are declining in these populations. We might need to... That's not what this was. It's a systematic, purposeful...
Conspiracy,
eradicating the white population.
Involving millions of people,
right?
In every country that wouldn't be involved. And you have elements of science and agriculture and the government and society.
And anti-Semitism, of course, because a lot of the people in charge of the conspiracy are the Jews.
Right. So I just made the connection that Alex Jones and all of his nonsense is probably related to this too, right?
Oh, he of course believes that the Great Replacement is in action and is absolutely being enacted.
Right. So, in the past, prior to doing this deep dive, I would have considered all these different groups to be disparate and maybe slightly related, but there's a lot of adherence to these central ideas that were, or at the very least, are central to the neo-Nazi movement, right?
Right, and in Camus' case, this French guy, a lot of his fears were around Muslim immigration because a lot of that is happening and has been happening in Europe. So a lot of the fears were specifically around Muslim immigration. But of course, it's been expanded and it's like no, it's any invasion of another population. Not to mention the Muslim fear as well.
Good.
Like it definitely includes the Muslim fear.
Obvious truths about the ongoing program of genocide against my race.
Predictably, the people supposedly running this plot are the Jews.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
So we've already rewatched this scene a couple times, and it just points to how it's central to the Unite the Right rally, because that's what we're looking at right now. And it's a mainstream idea within these groups. Not only the white replacement theory, but the idea that Jews are behind us and Jews are trying to replace white people. So let's continue watching.
The Great Replacement conspiracy theory has been doing the rounds since around 1916. Great Replacement theory was popularized by the French white supremacist Renaud Camus.
Okay, so a brief history that I'm sure involves a lot of different elements to it. So they're confirming what you were saying earlier.
Well, and certainly like the Nazis, obviously way before this Camus dude, the Nazis felt that there was a risk of, I don't remember if they were literally saying the Great Replacement. I don't think that phrase, but the same thing. Like basically, we are at risk here of our pure Aryan heritage being diluted by these dirty immigrants and these nomad peoples.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think there is an invasion. I think there is a colonization. Europe is colonized by Africa in a much more deeper way that Europe ever colonized Africa.
If you look at the kind of surge in popularity of Great...
So that's interesting. What he's saying is, look, yeah, we colonized Africa, but look what they're doing to us now.
And
do you know how laughable that is?
Well, right. And one interesting little bit, like if you were going to add asterisks in there, one was like, hey, sure, we colonized, but we didn't intermingle that much with their people, which A, they did, but B, that was considered bad to do.
Yeah.
Right. And whereas they're coming here and they're actually marrying our people, and there's a lot more of them than there are of us.
Right. It has two major narrative shifts that are completely false. One, that the colonization of Africa and other areas of the world wasn't so bad because it demotes it, right?
Yeah.
And then what's happening to them is horrible, right?
Yeah.
And so you can, as white people, if you're looking for a way to make yourself feel better about your ancestors, then in one fell swoop, that idea.
Yeah, like if you're, sure, we did, but what if what you're talking about is coming and delivering, technology and modernity to these savages? Well, sure, but that's not bad, right? This is different.
Replacement theory. It's really in the 2010s, and it's really, really important to localize that to fringe internet culture where these same ideas can gather speed, gather velocity, and gather popularity, and then spread from there to more mainstream spaces.
So that's another element that I learned in doing the deep dive that terrorizes me, that just is really scary. These online groups, and there are so many of them. Right. And, in between these chapters, I've been YouTube has been suggesting a lot of videos to me about this.
Right.
And there are so many small and large groups that are completely cut off from the outside world, and we don't have any access to it because it's a closed Discord group or something.
Right.
That are every minute of every day, it's effectively indoctrinating all sorts of people.
Yeah.
And there's all sorts of reasons why these things exist. It exists for reasons of we'll get into that in a later chapter when we talk about why would just a regular suburban teen become a neo-Nazi, having never been exposed to that information before. And of course, some people have, but later we'll get into that. But, he mentions that this great replacement theory, as the internet, again, we talked about this before, that I thought with the internet and Wikipedia and the spreading of information and exposure to other cultures would eliminate this sort of thing. But apparently it just made it more easy to manipulate people to become extremists and cult members.
Yeah, basically, if you rewind the clock, well, even 50 years or whatever, you and I might go to the tavern or the bar after work and gripe, like, man, all these white people arriving in our mixed culture neighborhood, right? But that's kind of where it starts and ends.
Yeah.
Nowadays, I can start my little online white hate group, and recruit members or, commiserate around the world.
24/7.
Yeah.
Memes and propaganda, contact, socializing.
In 2011, these ideas fueled one of the world's deadliest ever white supremacist terror attacks.
A massive car bomb shatters downtown Oslo. The target, the Prime Minister's office.
Anders Behring Breivik murdered 77 people in Norway, the vast majority of them children at a summer camp.
So what do you know about that attack?
Oh, yeah, I remember this. It's so horrific, man. I know that he was, an extreme right-winger, believed in all this stuff, and decided that the way to combat it was to basically go and start killing off the kids. So he got guns and he went to this camp and started shooting kids, and it was a massacre.
Yeah.
I remember when this happened, I was so lost in my head. I was like, I just can't understand that the human psyche can deviate so much that would cause someone to do that.
Right. So when this story first emerged, I don't remember the Great Replacement being a part of the,
the conversation wasn't there at that time. No.
Yeah. And what I walked away with was another crazy guy that had a bunch of guns and shot a bunch of people. And if you don't know this story, trigger warning, skip forward a couple of minutes. I didn't know he bombed a building.
Yeah.
I don't. That's not the main part of the story. Is that he went to an island that had a children's camp on it. He has lots of guns and rounds, and he not only kills the kids, but he killed a lot of the adults that were there too. And the problem was, because it's an island, he effectively
unfettered access.
Yeah, but he essentially corralled everyone in front of him. As he was killing people, everyone ran to the other side of the island, and they couldn't get off. They couldn't get away. And he just systematic, as the kids and the adults were, congregating and trying to get away, he just slowly shooting fish in a barrel, I guess is the phrase, right? And managed to kill, 77? Yeah. Then he was caught and put on trial, and he, I think, talked a lot about the white supremacy stuff. So again, when this story first came out, until recently, I would have characterized this as some wackadoo. But it's a part of a movement. That's what's so scary, that all of these people, the Buffalo shooter, the Pittsburgh shooter, the Unite the Right rally, the guy who ran over all those people in the street, they all come from the same cult. They all come from the same rhetoric and the same propaganda that all revolves around neo-Nazism.
The Christchurch Mosque shootings, the El Paso shooting in 2019, the Buffalo shooting you mentioned, the 2023 Jacksonville shooting, all of them mention Great Replacement.
Right. And they might have all been in the same Discord server or very similar. And that's a game changer. That's a complete shift for me in terms of my understanding of these events.
And by the way, of course, as if you were actually trying to stop the Great Replacement and be Machiavellian about it, these would definitely not be the right moves, right? Because it only works against it kind of creates hatred towards your people and belief systems.
Yeah.
And it only eliminates a few people at a time.
Right.
But you're saying that there's billions coming.
Right.
So these folks aren't actually...
It's not logical.
Logically thinking this through. but it's still being fueled by that fear and that hatred.
Right. In the same place that the conversation of the Great Replacement conspiracy is happening, there's talk about killing them all and wiping them out, fighting back. Now, I understand that one of the motivations that they do this, that they logically will say, well, yeah, this isn't going to put a dent in the Great Replacement, but it will cause a race war. And if we can get a race war going, then we will win because we're smarter, better, whatever, we're superior. We just need to light the match. And by doing this, it'll cause that problem. Charlie Manson was trying to start a race war. He apparently, when he was killing the white people in the rich home of Roman Polanski's house, right?
I thought they would blame it on black people.
He tried to, they wrote graffiti and whatnot to try to make it look
I don't
like...
remember that.
It was like die pig, it was anti-cop. And what they were hoping was that black people would be implicated, and the Charlie Manson group were pro-black people.
Right.
That's just so weird. They were pro-black, and they thought that the black people would win if a race... Anyway.
And the last step is that they would be in charge of the black people.
Oh, really?
Manson and his followers would survive the race war because
they would be
prepared.
Identified as an ally.
Right, and they were prepared. And then they would, because they are superior, they would be elected to rule over all the black people.
And you just think about, these white, young, impressionable minds during the era of protest and civil rights.
Right.
That they would be pro-civil rights and pro-progress, and how Charlie Manson might have cynically just tapped into that somehow as a way to motivate his power. You know what I mean? Anyway, so we have, this Great Replacement, you have Norway and other shootings. It all builds up to the Buffalo shooting, but you talked about New Zealand, the Christchurch shooting, so we're going to get to that.
But Breivik's actions didn't have the effect he wanted. Even for hardcore neo-Nazis, the mass murder of school children, most of them white, wasn't something they could get behind.
This terrorist attack was not something that was widely adopted by the European far right.
But one man would eventually follow Breivik's lead.
So before they get into the Christchurch mosque shootings in 2019, although what Vice is saying is that the neo-Nazis of today don't look to that killing as a valid action, there are plenty of memes and propaganda pieces within the neo-Nazi movement that absolutely uphold that man as a saint in their movement, right?
And by the way, I didn't know or remember, I must have known at some point, but I didn't remember that it was actually targeting the kids from the other party or whatever. So I think that's probably why he gets idolized so much, because in this weird, distorted, horrible way, he was seen as being done a blood sacrifice on their own blood to make a point, right?
Right.
It's interesting because you could say, earlier I was saying how like a lot of these one-offs where they go and kill N number of black people or Muslims or Jews or whatever it is, that by itself is so counterproductive to their own ideals. But and then you were pointing out that yes, and they think it'll start a race war. But this guy in his head, and probably in some of the other supporters' heads, was taking it a step further, saying, well, I'm not going to bother with that. I'm going to go after the people that are standing in our own way to make a point. And, it's crazy. It's not unlike what Hitler would do with his own German white opposition.
Right.
They would also get shot.
Right. They might admit, you're welcome to be part of our in-group.
Yeah.
But if you're not going to be part of our in-group, then you're just as bad as the enemy.
Yeah.
And so
we'll start with you, in fact.
Yeah.
Yeah. How horrible.
41 killed in one location alone, 7 at another mosque, and 1 person dying in hospital.
The man who is claiming responsibility and charged with murder is an extreme right-wing white supremacist.
I don't remember it being 49 dead.
Oh, man.
I mean, my God. So I think what Vice is saying is they learned from the lessons of the Norway shooting to say that, hey, yes, absolutely, kill, but don't kill white people.
White people.
You need to target the people that we're trying to get rid of.
Right.
The collaborators are bad, but the brown people or the Muslim people or the whatever people,
They should be the targets. Yeah.
They need to die. So you can imagine the killer, the Christchurch mosque killer, he is observing that conversation and thinking, oh, okay, well, here we go. Right?
Now, why were they saying New Zealand? I thought it was South Africa.
No, Christchurch is in New Zealand.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I got that wrong. All right.
An Australian white supremacist named Brenton Tarrant carried out a devastating Islamophobic terror attack, murdering 51 worshippers at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand.
So again, we've been talking about how this is a global problem. And we don't normally think of New Zealand as being this weapon-crazed murder
Nor Norway.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And yet
We
some
often
of the
point
worst
to Norway as like, look at great progressive.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of the worst shootings regarding neo-Nazism and the white replacement theory conspiracy were not in the United States. And that's a whole other level to the scariness of this.
In the U.S., of course, huge amounts of Islamophobia, especially after 9/11, all these things. However, the main theme of these movements in a lot of the European countries, and apparently in New Zealand too, is anti-Islamic, what they call the African invasion. Here, a lot of the focus is around the Jewish threat, and certainly other races, especially Latino,
Black.
dirty. Well, obviously, but it's like they don't think that there's a lot of black immigration still happening. They just would rather not have that. But most of the immigration they see as like all the Southern mudbloods and all powered by the Jewish cabal.
Right.
Yeah.
Tarrant explicitly modeled himself on Breivik, citing him in his manifesto as his true inspiration and sharing his delusional self-image of being a kind of medieval knight fighting to defend European civilization.
So yeah, I didn't know this. I didn't know that there's a through line of inspiration and copycat crimes, and that these are groups of people, because we talk a lot about mass shootings in the United States and how there can be copycat mass shooters. And sometimes, arguably, it's within some echo chamber, some problematic echo chamber, like with the Elliot Rodger manosphere. There's a similar propaganda action that's happening online. But some people seem to just be upset and angry, and they don't really have an agenda or a political ideology. They're angry and they want to kill, and then they might kill themselves as well. And those are copycat, but they're not necessarily being influenced by an online propaganda machine that goes back to Nazis and goes back to the eugenics movement of the early 20th century, late 19th. So when normally hear about these shootings, I would typically categorize them all in that group of, maybe they're influenced a little bit online, but, like Columbine.
Yeah.
Those guys weren't following some ideology. They were influenced by things, but it seemed to emerge from within them. It wasn't some calling that they were answering to, right? With these folks, though, these are, looked at in a certain way. These are soldiers in a global army against a particular enemy that doesn't have national borders. And that's a much more scary prospect, because you have organization and you have influence and support and sainthood for these people. You, if you're upset or disillusioned and you want to be worshipped for all time, by at least a group of people online, then that's going to be
the kind of people you would even care about in the first place.
Right. Then it helps to motivate to do this and justifies it. It might even supply you with the means and the education, and that is scary.
Yeah.
They say the man streamed his massacre live from a body camera.
His manifesto was spread in a specific way online, where he referenced memes, where he referenced sort of the internet culture he was a part of and came out of. The key.
Right, so they're highlighting one of the sentences of his manifesto, so to speak, and he's saying, "I have provided links to my writings below. Please do your part by spreading my message, making memes, and shitposting as you usually do." So that's terrifying because this individual felt supported and is predicting support afterwards and will probably get support afterwards. This isn't just some wackadoo person with a wackadoo motivation. This is someone that feels like he's doing his part, feels like he's doing something for the greater good, that he's on the right side.
Yeah.
He's a part of a larger organization and of a conversation. It's a cult, and it's a violent death cult, and that he would sacrifice himself. He probably knew that he would either die or go to prison, and he's like, yeah, absolutely, it's worth it, right? And how do we combat this, right? Because online discussions, like with Discord, they've been having some problems because of things like this, because the way that Discord is run, it doesn't really moderate much, right? Like, tell us about Discord.
Well, so you can create your channel, and you're kind of expected to moderate your own channel.
Server, they call them
your
servers.
server, and and then each server, like, you don't see, unlike Twitter, where it's sort of like publicly visible.
Right.
When someone's posting in Discord, if you're not part of that server and those channels, you just don't know what's being discussed.
Yeah, you don't have access. Also, for Facebook groups, I believe there are algorithms that will try to identify problems and flag things, right? Like, you can't just talk about...
That's right.
Like, you can have a closed group on Facebook, but
That's right.
there's still some moderation of topics and flagging of things. Whereas for Discord, they've had the philosophy of, look, it's your server, and unless someone flags it, then
you're fine.
Then we're never going to look into it.
And before Discord, and even now, and still now for sure, then you have the public 4chan, which is public. Anyone can see it. You don't have to, there's no limits. And it's just that, the content is not like permanently searchable, let's say, and two, everyone's anonymous.
Right.
But,
and people are anonymous on Discord too.
Right,
but Discord,
the difference is Discord's not publicly visible.
Right, so Discord creates the feeling, and it's real, that there aren't outsiders. On 4chan, there's an acknowledgement that, well, other people might see this. So,
but that's part of their point.
Right.
And so 4chan, especially the /B channel, is historically where a lot of these things originate and where they fester and where they congratulate each other. And not everyone is. Like, I used to be not active. Like, I wouldn't post a lot, but I would check 4chan all the time. 13 years ago, roughly, like 10 years ago, I was actively a lurker on 4chan, and it used to be kind of fun. I had to avoid certain threads because people, for whatever reason, loved posting gory images, like people being killed in gory ways, and I never had an interest in any of that. But a lot of the other discussions, what I thought was kind of fun and funny about 4chan is there were a lot of creative people on it that would come up with very funny memes and threads. As an example, they would do things where someone would come in, and you'd see this whole discussion where people were talking about penis inspection day. You're like, what? And they'd be like, oh yeah, does anyone remember, like the post would start, do you remember back in high school or in grade school and middle school where they would do penis inspection day? And of course that sounds ridiculous, but then someone would post, totally, oh, I thought I was the only one. And then all these people kind of winking at each other, but pretending like it was real. They would have this long thread about it.
And of course, there'd be occasional people sprinkling in of like, what are you guys talking about?
Exactly.
And
they would love that because they would love the lurkers that didn't know.
Right.
And so, but anyways, I actually found a lot of enjoyment in those kinds of things. And that was like maybe the least creative of them. There were many creative ones. Horror stories they would invent, the creepypasta, all these things. But there was also this undercurrent that started getting bigger and bigger of complete anarchic nihilism fueled with racism.
Yeah, and misogyny.
And misogyny.
And two things. One, I don't understand why you're not on Reddit if you liked 4chan. But two, because I use Reddit all the time and you don't. But two, this is another aspect that I didn't know about the neo-Nazi movement of today, which is that a lot of people will be recruited into these neo-Nazi groups online, and it will start like what you're saying, where it's an in-group There's a language of sarcasm and a willingness to, like the debate around rape jokes or pedophile jokes or Nazi jokes.
Yeah.
In the past, in particular, it was considered funny by most people to make those kinds of jokes.
And by these groups specifically, the idea, and I remembered relating to that feeling, was like, there's no boundaries in humor.
Right. And of course, for yourself, you would say, well, of course, rape is wrong.
Yeah.
Misogyny is wrong. But we all understand that. But it's still kind of funny to joke about it. Who's the joke on? It's sort of like with It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. They have a lot of racism and misogyny and other kinds of things. Is it a joke on
the victims or on them?
Yeah.
Yes.
and for It's Always Sunny, it's a joke on them.
Yeah.
But when you're in these online groups, where's that line? And what seemingly will happen for folks is, then some Nazi jokes or racism jokes, right, get kind of thrown. I guess it'd be racist jokes, like, black people or, Jewish people. And even though the individuals that are consuming that and seeing that wouldn't be baseline racist, other than the general racist and misogynistic notions that we all are indoctrinated into, but not extreme. And, at first they're just like, well, I know they're joking. But then it just slowly becomes the norm. And then over time, as a young, impressionable person, you just start thinking, well, it is kind of, because, you joke about that. And that was the thing about those kind of jokes, is that you joke about it enough and eventually you start believing in it.
Well, and it would get interspersed, because I remember this as well, then someone would make a serious post of like, all kidding aside, here's some research I came across. And then, and that's how, oh, well, I didn't know that.
Right. Yeah.
And so unfortunately, it's this environment where there is a reward for making the right joke and the more offensive one and the crazier thing. There's a reward for disrupting society, because like if you are able to like have one of your memes show up as news on a news channel, oh my gosh, you are praised. This kind of murdering is like an extreme version of that. Like, okay, well, I'm going to live stream the things that we're all joking and talking. I'm going to live stream me actually doing it.
Right. Like this guy's talking about.
Exactly.
He's talking about, I have provided links to my writings below. Please do your part by spreading my message, making memes, and shit posting as you usually do. I'm going to kill 49 people, and feel free to shit post later. Like, in what world? So if you're not in this world, then you're thinking, what? But if you're in this world, then you know. If you know, you know. And if you're not in this world, you might think, well, these are weirdos. No. Most people, young people, at least dip into this world. You know, the world that we're talking about. They're in some version of it. And it doesn't take much. Like people watching, you might have younger siblings or your own kids, people in your family that are in this very moment without you knowing anything about it, currently in one of these forums, in these Discord servers or in 4chan or 8chan or whatever, and they are being very slowly indoctrinated into some of the most horrific notions, not just like slight racism, but like absolute militant right-wing neo-Nazism, great replacement theory crap. I mean, look at QAnon. That's how QAnon, there wasn't a preacher on the corner. It was all these idiots in these echo chambers online being influenced and, going down it's almost, I'm sure there are studies around this of just like, how do these groups, these insular groups who are talking all the time, how do they start here and end up over here?
Yeah.
Is it something happening from the outside? Is it just a natural tendency of divergence because there's a tendency to want to? Because of course, if you just say something normal, you don't get a lot of engagement. Because the same rules apply within these groups, right? Yeah. The same rules apply on Twitter, right? That if you do a tweet right now and say something like, most people are good, but a couple people are bad. But we can work on it. If you say something like that, you're not going to get a lot of engagement.
Ooh, vanilla.
Yeah. But if you say all black people are X, Y, or Z,
you get a lot of engagement.
You get a lot of engagement, both hate and agreeing. The same rules apply within these servers, right? If you just say something kind of normal that everyone understands, then you get like, whatever. But you say something controversial, and I just wonder if the sociological phenomenon is such that no matter where any group starts, they eventually, if they are cut off from the outside world, they will end up, I'm sure there's probably studies that, they will become more and more strange because of that tendency.
That's quite possible. So I've mentioned this before in the podcast. When I was younger, I had this belief that my brain was powerful and immune to influence. Like, and I think a lot of younger folks believe this implicitly. So on these servers, part of the thing is like kind of getting in this mindset, like I can't be shocked.
By younger, you're talking like in your 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you meant when you were 5 or something.
Well, I'm sure I did, but no, I'm talking about as an adult, but younger. But by the way, in parentheses on that, like as an example, I used to love watching the most horrific horror movies I could find. And then what happened was when I had my first kid, I went to watch Human Centipede 2. And Human Centipede is a movie that I enjoyed. It's horrific, but I enjoyed it. But Human Centipede 2 is presented in this way where it's the whole premise of it was that a fan of the Human Centipede movie tries to reenact it in real life. And it's presented more like as a low budget kind of thing. And it's even more horrific. And it's kind of more gritty and almost real. When I went to watch it after my first kid was born, my daughter.
I will say that's a great premise for a sequel.
Yeah, but when I went to watch it, I actually had to stop because I had developed some weird sort of like, wait, especially I remember there was like a girl in it. And like, these are real, I mean, it's not real people, but these things happen in real life in somewhat, it's something triggered in me that had that changed.
Right, so we could say a lot of things. We could say having kids. We could say just getting older. We could say going through experiences. Like, I find for myself that it's much easier for me to automatically have empathy or sympathy for people when I went through what they went through.
Exactly.
And as I get older, I have more and more bad experiences.
So you can empathize more.
But when I was younger, I wouldn't necessarily know. And so but whatever, as you get older, people, it's studied that people tend to develop morally, prefrontal cortex, whatever.
But some people apparently not, because there's a lot of older folk that seem to get less empathetic.
But research shows that even for psychopaths, antisocial, other personality disorders, without treatment, they tend to improve over time. And lesser symptoms. Not always, of course. But my point is that we have a shit ton of people that are the ages between 12 and 25 who are online. And I don't know how old the Christchurch shooter was, but he didn't look old.
Right.
So you add up all of this activity, it's only going to get worse.
And what I was leading to is that when I used to be active on 4chan, it was actually before I had my first daughter and then a little bit after, but I also kind of prided myself and placed value on the idea that I can handle any joke, I can handle anything, like my brain is kind of immune to it. Now, I actually would explicitly avoid the really gory posts, but in my mind, I was like, well, but I'm choosing to do so. I could handle them, I just don't want to. And I've learned that this is all a fallacy. Like, it's not real. And the younger the brain is, I think it's even more vulnerable. So on these forums, in addition to the racism and all these things, they're exposed to actual constant, very, very graphic images of deaths, dismemberment, gore, and extreme pornography. And I'm not being Ted Bundy here. I'm just saying that I believe that by being immersed in that world, they are desensitized. And they're almost kind of, some of the trigger human empathy is reduced. Mm-hmm. And then you top it with the racism and the misogyny and stuff, and then you get an environment that can breed these unfortunate situations.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you slowly habituate to violence and interesting images that are garnering attention, and those are the ones that are going to float to the top of your page, that you become less and less concerned about human life and could lead to people becoming temporarily psychopathic, right? All right, well, so let's take a break, but when we get back from the break, it'll just be for patrons of the podcast. And I can't wait to get to this because this all culminates in getting to Neo-Nazis Today and Tucker Carlson. So we're going to, all of what I'm talking about is leading up to Tucker Carlson, one of the most famous and most followed media individuals of all time, who is saying great replacement language in his rhetoric, whether the followers know it or not. They're being swayed by a neo-Nazi conspiracy theory, which is even more terrifying. So if you want to see that, become a patron of the podcast. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.